Welcome everyone, this is Professor Cermak, and we are in section 1.3 on Gene Kilbourne and objectification. To start off this section, we are going to cover this term called social roles. Social roles can be a little tricky, but they go hand in hand with understanding the term social norms, those unwritten rules that guide our social behavior. So if we talk about how norms guide our behavior, the question would be, who is we, right? Who is our group? And social roles help us find labels and define the groups in society. Let me give you an example of a pegboard, so another analogy. In a pegboard, you can imagine that any social group or any social situation you enter, we all want to fit in. And that's like us. We are the pegs trying to fit in on the pegboard. Now, when we try to fit in, that process of getting in and staying in is governed by social norms, right? So how we fit into that peg hole is called the social norm. Now, when we talk about a social role, we're figuring out which pegboards we fit into. Okay, so on any given pegboard, there will be more than one option. Think about gender, and you could just think about the two basic categories, right? So some of us try to fit into the peg hole that is called man. Some of us try to fit into the peg hole that is called woman. And once we get into that pegboard, then we don't want to get pushed out, like we talked about in section 1.2. So we abide by those norms, we conform to those norms so that nobody will push us out, because most of us want to fit in. We want to have social connections. It gives us all kinds of benefits, and we want to have a group to belong to. So the pegboard is how we all try to stay on it. Once we get on it, it's governed by norms, but the holes themselves are the social roles, the categories, all right? So again, one simple category is going to be man, and another one is woman, but we can also get much more detailed, talking about going back to high school, where you can talk about the jocks is a common one, right? The athletes, or the so-called nerds. For every category, for every role, there's a technical way of talking about them, and then there is a way where they usually have a slang term, right? So nobody says like, oh, I belong in the nerd group, or I'm a dork, right? They actually just say, oh, like I just have my friends, but the rest of the social context puts the labels on them. Now it's on the sociologist to break it down into the three categories of race, gender, and class. And that's what we're going to start to do to break down social roles, as we ask those questions. Well, what are the race, gender, and class that is predominant in a certain social role? How do we see that? How is it represented in media? And that's how we start to look at social roles. All right, so let me give you an example of a role. So a role that is dominantly held for the man is the bro. Okay, I don't know how many of you guys have heard of that. It's pretty commonly used. People even call each other, hey bro, how's it going bro? Right, and that is actually a label that is used to describe a kind of man and how they try to fit into society. Okay, so again, the category is the role, and in this case, the category name, the label is bro. And what it's describing, if we break it down, is the dominant gender man, okay? And now it's funny because we talked about norms, and there's a set of norms for every role. And we talked about norms and we said they're unwritten rules. But if any of you guys remember the show How I Met Your Mother, there is an interesting book that they refer to constantly in this show, and it's called The Bro Code. And they actually turned it into a book that, a lot of people like that show, and it was about one of the main characters, Barney, who was basically a player, right, a ladies' man, and he was dating all the time, partying all the time, and he actually was always about representing brohood, right, or broness, right, being the top guy, being competitive, being dominant, getting a lot of girls. And that role is a very powerful role for many men in the American context. Even if we joke about it, or we say, oh, you're such a bro, or I'm not a bro, I don't think that way. But a lot of guys are aware of that role. And in some ways, we fit into that role, especially in high school when we're trying to figure things out, or in college as well. So the bro code is a funny example because it actually did get written down, even though it's kind of a joke. And if you just look at some of these words, right, a bro is always allowed to do something stupid as long as his bros are doing it. If a bro gets a dog, it must be at least knee height when fully grown, right? Pretty funny because, they're just all these little mini fake norms that are associated with this role. A bro shall not gaze at a naked bro, so governing how we relate to each other. A bro never dances with their hands above their head, right? So sorry, you guys who dance like that, that's not very cool, that's not very bro-ish. And so some of those are kind of funny, I think. But number 17 that I just put in there, there's, I guess, dozens of those. But I say, a bro never cries, right? And we've talked about that a little bit in our discussion of masculinity, where, okay, it's one thing to say, like, okay, man is just being a man, they're just showing off some masculinity. But if we're consistently denying our emotions, right, then that can add up, and that can create some other consequences. So it's good to think about the pros and cons, or the different norms that are associated with any given role, because no role is perfect. There are good roles, there are bad roles. Some of us think some roles are good, while others might think they're bad. And so it's not really about judging the role, it's just about defining it and why it's so salient, meaning why is it so prevalent or abundant in today's society. So a simple hypothesis we can use is saying, like, well, in our context, in our college or in your high school, whatever, do we see a large amount of bro-ish men? And if so, what is the consequence? Are they running the school? Are they helping people? Are they hurting people? Right? What is the consequence of that? And that's how we start to use these social norms and social roles in conjunction. So how do norms and roles affect our behavior? Well, just think of an example of a college with a party culture, right? And you go out and you finally get invited to a party with a bunch of bros, but people like bro parties because there's a lot of women there, and there's a good scene and it's fun, meet new people, all that, right? And so you are finally invited to the party. You go, you're ready to go, you're having fun, and the music comes on, and you dance with your hands above your head, and according to the bro code, you have violated that norm and you will be pushed out of the group, right? So I danced with my hands above my head, and oh man, next time I knew they were having a party, I didn't get the text, I didn't get the call to join the party. So I had been slowly edged out of that group, right? So that's an extreme example, and that's what I think it's pretty funny, and it illustrates how roles and norms work together, right? We all kind of want to belong to those popular roles, and especially when they match our gender and race and all that. But sometimes we get there and it doesn't quite fit, or you might have had that experience where you don't feel like you fit in, even in a place that you really wanted to get into, or a social scene that you really wanted to get into, or a group of friends or a place. And that's norms and roles acting on us and slowly making us feel uncomfortable, or implicitly kind of pushing us out. And so that's getting pushed off the pegboard in that example. Another quick example is the woman counterpart of the bro, who is the mean girl, right? So this concept of the mean girl, or the popular or pretty girl, is the role that is pretty prevalent in many American high schools and colleges. And it's interesting because that one has a mean label with it, although if we looked at it, it's really just about being a girl, first of all. So that's femininity, and showing off some sort of high style, popularity, certain kinds of attractiveness, and attached to it, though, is that somewhere along the line you become rotten to people, right? So the movie Mean Girls profiled how dominant this role was becoming in American high schools. And they did it, I'm sure many of you remember the movie with Lindsay Lohan. She comes from out of the country, and she has no idea about American social norms and social roles. And she quickly sees that the popular girls are very pretty and very stylish, but they trash all the other girls in the school, and they're dominant and they're mean and they're backstabby. And she starts out more like not like that, but then to get that popularity, to get that power, to fit into the pegboard, she actually becomes more of a mean girl, and then has her own epiphanies later on when she says, wow, this isn't who I am on the inside, yet I still see myself kind of like acting like that mean girl, and hurting other girls, and emotionally, and talking a lot of trash, and doing those kind of things. And so yes, it's all a movie and it's kind of dramatized, but it does show that it is response to how certain roles rise in power in our culture, and it makes a commentary on it, right? So in that case, the dominant woman's role for many young women in educational contexts is to become mean and not so nice of a community member to other people. So we look at those roles and we say, well, where are mean girls? Do they exist in our institutions, in our communities? And why, or what's driving that? What's pushing that? So all of that comes together to make, I think, an interesting example. So we have the bro and we have the mean girl, right? They go hand in hand oftentimes. And that's an example of two roles in American culture. Okay, so one of the pieces of media we're going to look at is by this woman, Jean Kilbourne. And she has a lot to say about women, their body image, their self-esteem, and what she calls objectification in the media. And this argument's the video we're going to watch is a little bit older at this point, but it's still, I think, very relevant and good to learn about to understand how we have come to talk a lot about objectification in our culture today. And I would argue that a lot of it is influenced by people like Jean Kilbourne, who took a lot of effort in spreading the word and showing real examples about how women's bodies are objectified in the media. So we're going to watch this. This is from a series which she was featured in called Killing Us Softly. And it was many examples of women's body in the media and people just dissecting the image and talking for real about those images, about how they made them feel, but also doing sociology, kind of comparing and contrasting images and talking about the themes they see in the image. And so since we are going to be doing our own content analysis, Jean Kilbourne is a really good example of someone who used a content analysis to make a very strong argument that affected society's view on media. So again, a lot of this is fairly common sense today, many years later, where we talk about objectification, we talk about problematic ways women's bodies are used in the media, we understand a little bit how we critique Barbie doll and Barbie doll culture, but Jean Kilbourne, again, was one of the OGs of discussing this. So we're going to watch an excerpt from some of her speeches that she used when she traveled to different colleges. And I want you to pay attention to a few things. First is just the question is she's going to make a clear argument for how advertisers objectify women. So we're going to start with saying that yes, advertisers, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, were objectifying women, which means to really, she'll use the word dehumanize women and the models by showing just certain parts of their body or emphasizing, just the sexualized parts of the body. And that's at the core of what objectification is. And so it's not news to say that women's bodies are objectified in the media, but she's going to make arguments for how it's done, and I want you to pay attention to that and try to pull that out of the video. The second thing I want you to note is now that we have these ideas of social norms and social roles and how they work together, I want you to understand and listen to what Jean Kilbourne says and how she uses those words norms and roles in her speech to make her argument, because she really does use a lot of sociology to explain herself. And her story is really interesting. She was actually in the industry, behind the scenes and as a model, and she saw everything, what it was like, all the pressures on women in the modeling and fashion industry, and she had her own epiphany and said, you know what, this is not okay. People need to know about what this is like, and the result where there's all this media that objectifies women is not okay for our society. That was her judgment call. So she really took it upon herself to start talking about this. She was featured in this series, Killing Us Softly, which shows many, many, many examples of what she's talking about. And you'll see excerpts of that in her speeches that go along with what she's talking about. So she uses norms and roles, so she became almost like a social analyst, like a sociologist, in order to spread the word more effectively and to have some talking points as she was showing all of her content analysis. So that's what I want you to look at, is how she uses norms and roles. She doesn't always use those exact words, but she uses words, fancy words like normalcy, which I want you to, again, pay attention to her vocabulary, pull out words that you don't understand, and make sure you understand how she's applying them. So we'll get deeper into that. So here's Jean Kilbourne, and we'll pick it up on the other side and ask some critical questions.
In the original Killing Us Softly, I said that I would be asking of you something that no one has ever asked before, and that is to take advertising seriously. These days, we do take advertising more seriously. Advertising has increased from a $20 billion a year to a $180 billion a year industry. The average American is exposed to over 3,000 ads every single day and will spend 3 years of his or her life watching television commercials, just the commercials. The ads, as you know, are everywhere. They're on radio, television, newspapers, magazines, billboards, bumper stickers. Here, one company brags about its ability to put advertising in your face all over the place. And at the same time, everyone in America still feels personally exempt from the influence of advertising. So wherever I go, what I hear more than anything else is, I don't pay attention to ads, I just tune them out. They have no effect on me. Now, I hear this most often from people wearing Gap t-shirts, but that's another story. It certainly is true, in fact, it's more true than ever, that advertising is the foundation of the mass media. The primary purpose of the mass media is to sell products. Advertising does sell products, of course, but it also sells a great deal more than products. It sells values, it sells images, it sells concepts of love and sexuality, of romance, of success, and perhaps most important, of normalcy. To a great extent, advertising tells us who we are and who we should be. What does advertising tell us today about women? It tells us, just as it did 10 and 20 and 30 years ago, that what's most important about women is how we look. The first thing the advertisers do is surround us with the image of ideal female beauty. So we all learn how important it is for a woman to be beautiful and exactly what it takes. Women learn from a very early age that we must spend enormous amounts of time, energy, and above all, money, striving to achieve this ideal and feeling ashamed and guilty when we fail. And failure is inevitable because the ideal is based on absolute flawlessness. She never has any lines or wrinkles. She certainly has no scars or blemishes. Indeed, she has no pores. Women's bodies continue to be dismembered in advertising. Over and over again, just one part of the body is used to sell products, which is, of course, the most dehumanizing thing you can do to someone. Not only is she a thing, but just one part of that thing is focused on. Most often, the focus is on breasts, since we are a culture that is certainly obsessed with breasts. And breasts are used to sell absolutely everything. The most dependable fishing line in the world. Women are constantly told we must change our lives by increasing our breast size, and the stakes are high. Does your husband wish you had larger breasts? And if he does, the implication is very clear. You better change your body, as opposed to changing your husband. Basically, we're told that women are acceptable only if we're young, thin, white, beautiful, carefully groomed and polished, and any deviation from that ideal is met with a lot of contempt and hostility. You never thought you'd lose your looks either. And look at the kind of real contempt that there is for this woman who's portrayed as completely valueless now. These days, the greatest contempt is for women who are considered in the least bit overweight, as in this classic, "I'd probably never be married now if I hadn't lost 49 pounds, which one woman told me was the best advertisement for fat she'd ever seen. The primary message that young women and girls get in our culture today is the message in this ad. At the top it says, "The more you subtract, the more you add." What a horrible message. The more you subtract, the more you add. At least 1 in 5 young women in America today has an eating disorder, the most common of which are anorexia and bulimia. And if you think of an eating disorder as any kind of disordered attitude towards eating and one's appetite, it's probably closer to 4 out of 5. Now, where else could this image of thinness come from, if not, at least in part, from the media images that surround us and that tell us in order to be acceptable, we need to be painfully, unnaturally thin? No wonder we have the highest rate of teen pregnancy in the developed world. In general, teenagers are hypersexualized in our culture today. Here, a young woman, very young, very thin, walking down the street, envisioning herself in black lace. A magazine for young women and girls called Jane has on the cover an article, 15 Ways Sex Makes You Prettier. There continue to be lots of ads that normalize and trivialize battering. And battering is the single greatest cause of injury to women in America. Imagine an ad like this with a woman being shot. Trivializing copy like this, great hair never dies. Advertising is one powerful force that keeps us trapped in very rigid roles and in very crippling definitions of femininity and masculinity. We need to get involved in whatever way moves us to change not just the ads, but these attitudes that run so deep in our culture and that affect each one of us so deeply, whether we're conscious of it or not. Because what's at stake for all of us, men and women, boys and girls, is our ability to have authentic and freely chosen lives, nothing less.
All right, so let's talk about what she was throwing at us in that. First of all, we said, how do they objectify women? And one of the main things I want you to look at is that she's picking apart the image, and she uses the word dismemberment. Okay, so dismemberment is a strong word, but some of the media, as you saw, has some pretty strong themes. So she doesn't pull any punches. I really like her style, and she talks about dismembering, which the literal word to dismember means to chop off anything that is sticking off of your body, right? So that's kind of a morbid term, but the lingo is also sometimes called body chopping in the media. And so the model's body, she says, are dismembered in contemporary media culture. And of course, they're not actually physically chopped, right? That would be horrific. But she says the camera and the viewing angles are chopping a woman's body, right? And we saw that plain and clear when we see a pair of breasts used to sell fishing line. And you don't even see the woman's face, right? Literally just the pair of breasts are framed in the whole frame of the picture. Her face is cut off. The rest of her body is cut off. We see that happen time and time again with just the rear end of the woman. And Jean Kilbourne says, well, that's dehumanizing. That is the essence of objectification. And it's something that shows up so much in American media that it becomes a major theme. That's her main point, is that ads are used to sell not just products, but norms, right? She uses the word normalcy, which is really just a fancy way of talking about norms. And she's saying that ads sell us these norms and we buy into them, right? We buy into the sexuality, the love, the romance, and we love to talk about it and we love how it makes us feel, and that's what we buy when we're willing to spend an exorbitant amount for something that is just like functionally a pair of shoes or functionally, a shirt, right? We'll go out of our way to spend way more than is necessary because of the style, because of the stories behind the brands. So really, she's saying that, yes, there's nothing wrong with branding, but when you're using objectification as your main point to brand, that does start to have a macro effect, right? We use our sociology where all these little micro transactions, these ads that show just a pair of breasts or just a rear end, they add up to a culture, a whole society where we devalue women. And you can look at it in the copy. Women's bodies are chopped. They are downplayed. Their subjectivity, their agency, right? Their personhood is downplayed. It's not as prevalent in the media as when we compare it to men. And that's why that's a significant piece to look at. And that's why she started to make this argument. And yes, years later, we are starting to pay attention in movements like the Me Too movement, where people said, oh yeah, we just kind of took it before that women get slightly sexually harassed in office culture a lot. But now people are saying, you know what, now enough is enough. And media culture has started to change as well, as we talked about body positivity in the previous section and how that is changing our media culture. But all that is tied into Jean Kilbourne's arguments about how she uses norms and roles. The other main piece about this that's worth paying attention to is how she talks about roles. she lays out roles very clearly as a spectrum, right? Where, yes, we all fit into roles, but if that role that you're trying to fit into is, she uses the word crippling, right? So we try to fit into these crippling roles, or we cripple ourselves to try to get into these roles, is a really important sentiment, because she's pointing out that, yes, we all fit on that pegboard, we all want to, but some of us lose a big piece of ourselves in order to fit in, sort of like that Mean Girls reference we talked about. And she saw that so much in her real life that that's why she wanted to point it out in media, and saying that that the micro details are blowing up into this macro eating disorder culture, right? That's where she sort of brings that her discussion, which is that this is, yes, is objectification, but it is directly affecting and instigating eating disorder culture. So she brings up like the 1 in 4, eating disorder statistic for many young women, and that's a dated statistic, and she's saying it's probably worse, and it has become slightly worse over the years. And she's saying that this media culture where it's all about thinness and airbrushing and all that really has created a generation of young women who are hypersensitive and hyper internalize this idea of, that you have to be skinny, you have to cover up your flaws. And we saw that a lot in section 1.2 as well. So just tying that together and seeing again how she says they objectify women through body chopping, through focusing on just certain parts of the body, and then that this forces us or pushes us or teaches us to try to fit into those roles, even if it's going to cost us a lot along the way. And she's talking specifically about women, right? We looked at men, but here she's talking specifically about women. And it's, of course, something she knows a lot about as a woman herself, and she packages it up into this content analysis where she's not just telling us what she thinks off the top of her head. She's saying, look at this ad, look at that ad, look at this one. Again and again and again, we see this in our ad culture. And I like the way she picks that apart. So I hope you'll use that as a good cornerstone of this case on objectification. So at this point, we've defined norms and we've defined roles, and they wrap together in the pegboard. And we need a term that describes an encompassing way of looking at the process where we all try to fit into our own pegboards, and we all go through life fitting into pegboards, getting kicked out of some, choosing to leave others, and that's the sum total of our social experience, is trying to fit in, getting pushed out, trying to make sense of it, feeling hurt and shame, or feeling great and empowered, right? All of that is the background to our social life. So the word we're going to look at is called socialization. Okay, do not confuse this with socializing. I see this all the time. Socializing is like I go to a party and we talk, and that's just like interesting. And it's tricky because, yes, that is sort of part of this term socialization, but not to be confused with socializing, which is just me talking to someone like at a social gathering. That's just socializing. Socialization is from social science, and it describes this process where we get our norms and roles. So a quick case here, just to look at, this is still part of 1.3, but it's a good historical case from social psychology. And we just ask these questions. So where do norms and roles come from? Not what they are, but where do they come from? Where do we get them? And then when do they start, right? I say if you had to give it a number, like an age, what age do we start to get our norms and roles? When does socialization start? Is an interesting question, especially when we are trying to back it up with science and research, okay? So the first question, where do they come from, right? I just want to avoid people saying, oh, it comes from culture, it comes from society, right? Society, man, it shapes us all, right? That's not a informed answer, right? That's just kind of an off-the-cuff answer. And so that's why this term socialization exists, so we can start to describe the process where we get our norms and roles. So we're going to divide that up and talk about the different areas of society to give a better resolution on where we understand major forces that shape us in our social world. So let's talk about the Goldberg and Lewis gender research. And this goes all the way back to 1969. And I'm just going to read this case to you. This is a case summarized in a textbook. This is a famous social research that teaches us about socialization. So Goldberg and Lewis asked mothers to bring their 6-month-old infants into their laboratory, supposedly to observe the infant's development. Covertly, however, they also observed the mothers. They found that the mothers kept their daughters closer to them. They also touched their daughters more and spoke to them more frequently than they did to their sons. By the time the children were 13 months old, the girls stayed closer to their mothers during play, and they returned to their mothers sooner and more often than the boys did. Then Goldberg and Lewis did a little experiment. They set up a barrier to separate the children from their mothers who were holding toys. The girls were more likely to cry and motion for help, the boys to try to climb over the barrier. So this is a now famous experiment that was one of the first experiments that tried to tackle this question of when and how does socialization work, right? When do we start to pick up gender norms and start to embody gender roles? So first we want to note that this is telling us that these kids, right, they're infants, right? So less than 6 months. So basically age 0 these kids are showing gender specific behaviors, and it seems to be connected to how they are treated by their mothers. Okay, so imagine, this is funny. They didn't have all the rights for experiment people like back then, so they could lie to them and fudge the truth a little bit. And so they would tell you that, let's say you have an infant, and they said, come in and get a free checkup or something like that. And so you have your little baby, and while you're waiting in the waiting room, there's like people watching you with cameras and behind two-way mirrors, and they're checking every time you touch your baby and every time you talk to your baby. And they literally counted that for several pairs of mothers and infants. And so they have this data and a little bit of evidence that is correlated with this change in behavior. So they saw that, yes, women, the mothers who have baby girls, they would hold them close, right? You can probably think of how this actually works, right? Like, oh, my beautiful little princess, I'm never going to let anything happen to you, right? Talking to the girl in the baby voice and like holding her close and touching her and fixing her hair and her clothes, right? And that is what they saw for many pairs of mothers and baby girl infants. And then that's what they were seeing resulted, as they argued, in a behavior where when they were given a little bit of adversity, right? Oh, here's a toy and there's a little barrier. The girls were like, oh, mommy, I need that. And they start crying. Okay, and they wouldn't move. They'd just kind of start crying until maybe they got the toy. Now the boys, on the other hand, had a correlation where they didn't get touched as much. They didn't get talked to as much. And this kind of rings true from some of my experience, right? Where it's like, the parents, like, you're walking around somewhere and you smack yourself and you get, you start crying, and they, instead of saying, oh, poor baby, right, they'll like smack you on the back of the head and say, hey, Tiger, get back in the game, just go, keep running, you're fine, shake it off, right? And so that's kind of what they saw with the mothers and the baby boys, and they saw that this actually was connected to a change in behavior, and where when they gave the little boys a barrier and a little toy behind it, the boys wouldn't cry right away. They would more often just try to scramble over the barrier. So that's the beginning of how we interpret this experiment, where it looks like there's gender-specific behavior, right? Gender norms already showing up in year 1, right? Year 0. So that's what I want you to take as a first piece of evidence from this experiment, that socialization starts at year 0. So how do we interpret that experiment? Well, if you're back in the 70s, where there was a lot of masculinity going along, especially in research, that, we're really, you don't want to say, man, this looks like it proves that men are supposed to be more independent, right? Nice job, guys. We pat ourselves on the back and we say, look, there's proof, right? Guys, even at year 1, are already like taking charge, taking matters into their own hands, where we're not like little girl crybabies, right? And obviously that's the wrong way to interpret this, but some people certainly, when this first came out, they were talking about it that way. Now, that's not true, right? So we want to pull out the gender norms that we're seeing. And one of the clear norms is independence or dependence, right? What we're seeing is a behavioral norm that we could label as independence in the boys and dependence in the girls. And then we want to go macro and later in life and say, what trends does this remind us of? If this norm is being set up so early, how does that show up later in life? Does it? And, does that give us more power behind diagnosing this norm? And yeah, I think a lot of you can relate, right? That yes, well, this sort of independence in men, that it's supposed to be instinctive or something, is really not. It's actually set up from the beginning because of how we're treated by our social world. And we shouldn't be so quick to congratulate it, because independence can be good in some measure, but certainly it has its drawbacks when it's overused, right? So the classic man, teenage 20-year-old man that wants to take everything on his shoulders and says, you know what, yeah, I got this, right? I can totally hang, I can totally have everything I want, right? And if the world is going crazy, I'm just going to keep taking it on my shoulders and I'll be able to get through it. And then it turns out we can't, right? When the stuff really hits the fan, nobody can take all of life's hardships all at once. And because we men are so independent, we often don't know how to ask for help, right? Which is the essence of a norm of dependence. So yes, that little girl who's just a year old looks like she's a big crybaby and whatever. Young girls cry and young boys cry a lot. And what we could interpret that as is actually being able to reach out for help, and that norm shows up later in life. That yes, women, when again the stuff hits the fan and life turns into crisis, they know how to use their social networks more so that they don't feel like the whole world is on their shoulders all the time, and they don't crack and lash out and explode as much as guys might. All right, so again, that's a hypothetical, but it is an extrapolation of these norms, and those norms should sound familiar because it is a common gender norm for, again, 18, 19, 20-somethings to embody that. They've even studied that, where time and time again, groups of men and groups of women on subtle things like what kind of jobs they choose to apply for. They show more independence and initiative for men and less for women. And that's really a powerful norm that could, of course, shape our very futures. So for the Goldberg and Lewis gender researchers, remember, socialization starts at year 0, year 1, as early as possible. And that also, it shows us these norms of independence and dependence, and how independence is sort of taught to or pushed on boys early on, and dependence is taught to or pushed on girls early on. And that's a major set of norms that shows up later in the macro sense as well. So we can tie this all together with this term, agents of socialization, which I don't really want to even remember it as a term, but as this graphic here with these 6 bubbles, and all of these are the major forces that act on a person. All right, so we, as sociologists and anthropologists, we went around the world, right? This is like since the history of these fields, and they started to say, once they identified that socialization is an interesting concept, they said, well, what are the major parts of societies, of all different kinds of societies, that shape our roles and norms? And so they went and compared, super modern societies like a New York City or a Tokyo kind of place with super technologies and, high urbanization. And then they also went to places like the edge of the Amazon, where there's, small groups of people that live right next to the rainforest, and they are living much more of a subsistence lifestyle, kind of a tribal lifestyle, and totally different, in terms of resources, in terms of culture, but they still found these common agents of socialization. So here, agents just means, forces. So what are the different forces within big society? And we can look at them here, just, follow along with this graphic. We have school, family, popular media, work or vocation, place of worship, which in this case just means religion. You can think about it that way. And recreation. Think about like going to a gym. All right, so these are the major themes that seem to be stable across all different kinds of human societies. And we call these the agents of socialization, to help us break down and get a better resolution on how we are shaped. So based on this section 1.3, we can see that the Goldberg and Lewis research, which we just spoke about, is showing a strong family force on the person, right? Starting at year 0, the family starts to socialize us into certain gender norms and roles. Okay? If we go to Jean Kilbourne, she's going to argue that popular media is a major socializing force, and her story isn't such a happy story, right? She's saying that it's a socializing force that pushes young girls to become women with eating disorders, to feel crippled by fitting into that role of being the thin, beautiful, attractive woman. Okay, so that's where we can start to parse it out. And we'll talk more this week in discussion about how that applies to you, but simply put, we use this model to apply to ourselves and say, what are the major socializing agents that were prevalent in my life and why, right? That's a hard question sometimes, right? So was your family a major socializing force where you got your ideas of your masculine or feminine identity, or however you choose to identify? Did you get that from your family? Maybe did you define it against your family, right? You didn't like their gender norms and roles, so you pushed away. All these forces are acting on us at all times, and they act in different levels, and we respond in different ways as well. So with family, right, that's an easy question because most of us did get early on in our lives lots of norms and roles from our family, but ask harder questions. What if someone didn't have a family, right? What if they had an unusual family situation? How does that change the norms and roles that show up? You know, a common change that's happened over the last 60, 70 years is most people grew up in the United States with double parent families, right? Like a mom and a dad, and you know, the nuclear family as it's called. Today, more people are not having that situation, right? Families get split up, there's a lot more divorce, 50% plus divorce rate, and so a lot of people are growing up in single parent households. So that agent of family is really changed. Now, we don't know if it's changed for the better or for the worse or how, right? But we do know that it's changed, and it helps us start to ask questions about how socialization differs between people who have a different family arrangement. Same thing with school, same thing with work. And then, we can also use this to look at competing factors and ask for good remedies for when we have a tension between these two, right? So one of the examples is, I hear it all the time as a college professor, right? Hey, Professor Cermak, I wanted to get that assignment done, but I had to work, 12-hour shifts for forever, and so I couldn't get my schoolwork done, and now my GPA is going down, and I'm getting late deductions and all that, right? So that's an example that the agent of socialization for work is very strong and is pulling us in one way, and school is also very strong because there's high payoffs, but it's pulling us in the other way, and that creates all kinds of problems. It creates stress, depression, anxiety, right? A lot of people go through that, and then we want to ask, is there a society with a better balance of those two agents, right? And certainly some societies do undergrad for free, or they do better intertwining with heavy work schedules so you can work and make money and get your schooling and more advanced degrees. And so those are questions that we need to ask so we can look at the world around us and say, well, do we need to change to the relationship between those agents of socialization, and how do we start that change if it's causing problems, or if it's causing benefits? How do we do this? Can we help other places, regions, communities have a better balance between those? So it's almost like a car model where that term firing on all cylinders is when your engine is running the best and going in a strong direction. Well, we see that in many societies where most of these different agents of socialization are working for people, then all at the same time, then you have people that report being happier, being more well, having a better sense of future, knowing what they want to do, having a sense of purpose, and that's what most people are after. But unfortunately, in today's world, right, we do see a lot of societies, including our own American society, where some things are sort of falling apart. Some of these agents of socialization are not so prevalent, and we're starting to see the repercussions. So this graphic can be used as a deficit model, knowing where things are moving, as a tension model, understanding the forces that pull us in too many different directions, or just trying to understand what was most prevalent in your life and why, and starting to ask those questions. But it all stands that the agents of socialization, again, are these forces that shape us into norms and roles, and this helps us see different areas. And in the future and in this course, I'll consistently ask you to kind of like pull out the agents of socialization that are affecting any case or study that we are looking at in a given context. That is section 1.3 on Jean Kilbourne and objectification. I hope you can use her case and her video that we watched to help you understand these terms like social roles, the Goldberg and Lewis gender experiment, and how it fits in to socialization and the agents of socialization. So make sure you have those terms. I would also say that this week and in this point of the course, we're going to start to talk about developing your own content analysis. There is a separate video on the content analysis and where to get started, and lots of resources online. But it's time to start thinking, sort of like Jean Kilbourne. You can take inspiration from her of, what pieces of media do you feel strongly about, the messages and the images in those media, and what might you want to analyze for your content analysis research project. And I will walk you through in the other videos and in the online resources how to get that started. So I hope you found this interesting. Good luck, again, as usual, finding your own definitions for each of these key concepts, making sure you have a good working definition before you move on to the content analysis or to 1.4, and we'll keep developing these as we go along. So I'll see you in discussion this week, and have a good week.